I didn't start listening on purpose. That's the part people expect me to lie about. They imagine curiosity, boredom, some voyeuristic itch, something small and shameful that grew teeth later. But that isn't how it began. I started because I couldn't sleep. Sleep had been unreliable for months before the voice appeared. The kind of sleep where you drift off for 10 minutes at a time and wake up already exhausted, your mind racing ahead of your body. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, tracking the cracks like constellations, counting the seconds between passing cars outside. The building never fully rested. It sighed. It creaked. It shifted its weight like an old animal trying to get comfortable. The pipes knocked in the walls, sharp and metallic, as if someone was tapping them from the inside to be let out. The floors expanded and contracted with the temperature, making slow, groaning complaints. Somewhere above me, a neighbor paced back and forth, their footsteps following a pattern I tried and failed to memorize. And then there was the voice. At first, I thought it was a television, a late-night movie bleeding through the drywall. The cadence felt rehearsed, almost scripted. But there was no laugh track, no background music, no other voices intruding. Just a man speaking steadily in a tone so controlled it bordered on gentle. He wasn't on the phone. I listened carefully for the rhythm of conversation, the pauses where another person might speak. They never came. He wasn't arguing, he wasn't reacting, he was delivering something. It sounded like someone practicing the truth. I rolled onto my side, pressing my ear closer to the wall, then immediately felt embarrassed for doing it. The wall was thin, but not that thin. I told myself I was imagining it, that exhaustion was turning noise into meaning. I closed my eyes and tried to count backward from 100. The voice continued. Low, calm, careful. I didn't mean for it to happen. The sentence slipped through the wall like smoke, soft but unmistakable. I froze, my body reacting before my mind caught up. That wasn't a line from a movie. No actor delivers regret like that. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sharp. It was flat in a way that felt practiced. I held my breath without realizing it. She trusted me. That one landed harder. Those words don't drift. They don't dissolve into the noise of a building settling. They arrive intact, carrying weight with them. My chest tightened, a slow, creeping pressure like the start of a panic attack that hadn't decided whether to commit yet. I sat up in bed, staring at the wall like it could see me. Like it knew I was listening now. The paint was off-white, uneven in places where previous tenants had tried and failed to fix it. A faint scuff mark ran vertically near the corner, as if someone had dragged furniture too close too many times. There was no response from the other side. No second voice, no interruption, just him continuing to talk into the dark. I told myself it wasn't my business. Everyone deserves privacy. People talk to themselves. People rehearse apologies they'll never give. People confess imaginary crimes out loud because the words feel safer once they've been spoken. That's what I told myself. But the nights kept going. And so did he. Night after night the fragments continued. Never in a straight line, never with context, regret without names, guilt without dates. Images dropped like stones into still water, each one rippling outward and refusing to settle. A room with no windows. I thought someone would stop. I checked the mirror twice. His tone never changed. That was what unsettled me the most. There was no panic in his voice. No shaking, no escalation, just memory delivered evenly as if he'd gone over it so many times that emotion had worn itself smooth. I tried sleeping with music on. Low at first, then louder. I tried white noise apps, rain sounds, static. The voice slipped through anyway, threading itself between frequencies, finding gaps I didn't know existed. Some nights I convinced myself it had stopped. I'd lie there, tense but hopeful, waiting for the first sentence to arrive. When it didn't, relief would wash over me so suddenly it made my eyes sting. And then, I should have said something. The words would appear, perfectly timed to shatter the illusion. I started structuring my nights around it without admitting that's what I was doing. I stayed up later, pretending I just wasn't tired. I positioned my bed closer to the wall under the excuse that it made the room feel bigger. I stopped inviting people over, telling myself I needed space. That work had drained me more than usual. The truth was simpler. I didn't want anyone else to hear it. Because if someone else heard it, I'd have to do something about it. One night, sometime after 2 in the morning, without thinking it through, I recorded it. I didn't plan it. I didn't set out with intent. I was lying there, staring at the ceiling again, phone in my hand for no reason other than habit. The voice started mid-sentence, already in motion. I remember the smell. Before I could stop myself, my thumb slid across the screen. The recording app opened with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room. I held the phone against my chest at first, then closer to the wall, my heart pounding so hard I worried it would drown him out. I told myself it was for clarity, proof that I wasn't imagining things, evidence that exhaustion hadn't finally tipped me into hallucination. The recording was clear. Too clear. When I listened back the next day, sitting on my couch with sunlight spilling across the floor, his voice sounded closer through my headphones than it ever had through the wall. Intimate, detailed. Every breath, every subtle shift in tone captured perfectly, like he was standing just behind me, leaning in. I pulled the headphones off so fast one of them clattered to the floor. I didn't delete it. That should have been my first real warning. After that, I recorded every night. At first, it was inconsistent. I'd forget or I'd hesitate too long and miss the beginning. But soon it became routine. Phone out, app open. Recording started as soon as the first word slipped through the wall. I began organizing the files, labeling them by date, by time. I told myself I was being responsible, methodical, detached. But I listened to them over and over. As days passed, the confessions grew heavier. The images sharpened. Details accumulated in ways they hadn't before, as if repetition had given him permission to go deeper. A room with no windows became the light never changed in that room. A road where no one stopped became I slowed down twice. No one even looked. And then there was the bracelet. I noticed it because it caught the light, he said one night, his voice unchanged. Silver, cheap clasp, she wore it every day. My stomach dropped. I knew that detail. Not from him, from somewhere else. A memory I hadn't touched in years suddenly surged forward, uninvited and sharp. A missing person case that had briefly dominated the local news before fading into the background noise of everything else. A woman who vanished on her way home from work. No witnesses, no body. The article had mentioned a silver bracelet. It had been one of the few identifying details they'd released. A way for people to help. A way for hope to stay alive just a little longer. I paused the recording with shaking hands. I told myself it was a coincidence. Silver bracelets are common. Missing people are tragically common too. Cities are built on overlapping tragedies that never meet. But once the thought was there, it refused to leave. I started cross-referencing dates, times, his phrases against archived news articles. I told myself it was curiosity, that I was just trying to prove myself wrong. The timeline aligned too easily. The night he mentioned the road, the description matched a stretch of highway just outside the city, a place where streetlights thinned out, where the shoulder dropped away into brush, a place I'd driven more times than I could count. The room with no windows. There had been speculation about a storage facility, an abandoned one, the kind of place no one checked unless they had a reason to. I sat there, surrounded by notes I hadn't remembered making, my phone buzzing softly as another recording finished uploading to the cloud. That was when the thought finally settled, heavy and undeniable. I wasn't overhearing something private. I was listening to a crime. And worse, much worse, I had been nearby the night it happened. The memory came back in pieces, the way all inconvenient truths do. I was driving home late, the radio on low, my phone lighting up with a notification I didn't check. I remembered slowing down because of headlights pulled over on the side of the road. I remembered an argument, muffled, indistinct, the kind of sound you can pretend is anything else if you don't look too closely. I remembered telling myself someone else would handle it. I drove on. The realization didn't hit all at once. It seeped in, saturating everything. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Every recording on my phone suddenly felt heavier, as if it knew something about me I'd spent years avoiding. That night, when his voice came through the wall again, I didn't record it right away. I just listened. I thought about stopping, he said softly, more than once. I pressed my palm flat against the wall without realizing it, the cool paint grounding me in a way nothing else had. On the other side, he continued, unaware, or pretending to be. I tell myself it's too late now. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window, eyes wide, face pale. I didn't recognize myself in it. Because for the first time, the voice wasn't just confessing. It was mirroring. After that night, the listening stopped feeling passive. Before, it had been something that happened to me, sound bleeding through walls, an inconvenience I hadn't asked for. Now it felt deliberate, like I was choosing to sit there and receive it. Like tuning a radio to a station I knew was dangerous and leaving it there anyway. The wall no longer felt neutral. During the day, I caught myself glancing at it while brushing my teeth, while making coffee, while tying my shoes before work. In daylight, it looked harmless, just drywall and paint, maybe a few studs and wires buried inside. But I knew what came through it at night. I knew what it carried. Sleep became something I prepared for, like an event I didn't want to attend. I started staying up later, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, letting the minutes stretch thin until exhaustion forced my eyes closed. Sometimes I'd wake up to the sound of his voice already mid-sentence, my body jolting awake as if I'd been called by name. Other times, I stayed awake on purpose, waiting. That was the worst part. Waiting meant anticipation. Anticipation meant responsibility. He didn't speak every night anymore, or maybe he did and I just missed some of it. The gaps made everything worse. Silence stopped feeling like relief and started feeling like a held breath. When he did speak, the structure changed. The early recordings had felt scattered, like thoughts slipping out accidentally. Now there was an order to them, a rhythm. He started revisiting the same moments, adding detail each time, refining them. I didn't plan it, he said one night, but I thought about it. That distinction lingered with me long after the recording ended. Another night. I told myself I was helping. Helping, the word scraped against something raw in my chest. I began to recognize patterns in his speech. He spoke more on certain nights, Sundays mostly, less on Fridays. On nights when it rained, he paused longer between sentences, as if listening for something beyond the wall. Sometimes he laughed. It was never humor. It was short, breathless, almost surprised, like the sound escaped him before he could stop it. The first time I heard it, I flinched so hard my phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor. I listened to that laugh on repeat the next day, headphones pressed tight against my ears. It didn't sound like joy. It sounded like disbelief, like someone standing at the edge of something irreversible and marveling at how far they'd gone. I stopped telling myself I would go to the police. Instead, I told myself I was collecting enough first, enough evidence, enough certainty, enough distance from doubt to justify what would come next. But every night I waited, the excuse got thinner. The recordings started to feel less like evidence and more like collaboration. I hated that thought. I hated how quickly my mind supplied it. One evening, as I came home from work, I noticed his door was cracked open. Just slightly. A thin line of darkness cutting through the hallway light. I slowed without meaning to, my footsteps quieting instinctively. I didn't look inside. I don't know why. Fear, maybe, or shame, or the irrational certainty that if I saw him clearly in the daylight, something fragile would break, that the voice would lose its abstraction and become undeniable. Instead, I walked past. I unlocked my door. I stepped inside my apartment and locked it behind me, the click echoing too loudly in the small space. That night, he spoke earlier than usual. "I wonder who hears me," he said. My blood ran cold. The sentence wasn't directed at the wall. It wasn't projected outward. It sounded inward, reflective, like he was genuinely curious. I stood frozen near my bed, phone clutched in my hand, unsure whether to record or run or do nothing at all. I used to think no one did, he continued. That felt safer. Safer. I sat down slowly, my legs weak beneath me. He didn't mention the bracelet again for a while. When he did, it was almost offhand. I kept it longer than I should have. The way he said it, without emphasis, without remorse, made my stomach twist. I began dreaming about the wall. In the dreams, it was softer than it should have been. When I pressed my hand against it, my fingers sank in slightly, like flesh. I could feel vibrations beneath the surface, like a heartbeat, like breathing. Sometimes I dreamed that the wall disappeared entirely, leaving the two apartments merged into one impossible space. His voice came from everywhere then, from the ceiling, from the floor, from inside my own head. I woke up gasping, sheets tangled around my legs, the sound of my own breath too loud in the dark. During the day, I tried to live normally. I went to work. I answered emails. I laughed at the right moments in conversations, but everything felt slightly out of sync, like I was half a second behind myself. I noticed how often people confess things casually. Small things, inconsequential things. I shouldn't have said that. I probably shouldn't tell you this. Don't judge me, but... I wondered how many confessions went unheard. How many people carried them alone because no one was listening, or because someone was and chose not to react. The recordings filled my phone's storage. I backed them up twice, once to the cloud, once to a hard drive I hid at the back of a drawer beneath old paperwork and receipts. I didn't trust myself not to delete them. One night, after hours of silence, I was just starting to drift off when his voice returned, closer than ever. "I know someone's there," he said quietly. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it hurt. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locking in place. "I don't know who," he continued, "but I can feel it." I stared at the wall, my vision blurring, my ears ringing. "I think I always could." The sentence hung there, heavy and unfinished. I waited for more, it didn't come. That was the first night I didn't sleep at all. Morning arrived thin and gray, light leaking through the blinds like it was unsure whether it belonged. I sat on the edge of my bed, still dressed, phone dead in my hand, recordings queued but untouched. I kept thinking about the night on the road, the way I'd slowed down, the way I'd decided that was enough, that acknowledging something was happening was the same as intervening. I told myself I was different now, but I was still listening. And listening, I was learning, had consequences. That evening, as I unlocked my door, I heard movement on the other side of the wall. Not a voice, footsteps, closer, slower, like he was standing still and shifting his weight. For the first time, it occurred to me that he might hear me too. My key hovered inches from the lock. I realized with a sudden clarity that made me dizzy that walls don't just carry sound. They carry attention. After that realization, I started noticing attention everywhere. Not just hearing, being heard. The way conversations shifted when someone realized they had an audience. The way people lowered their voices instinctively, even when they weren't saying anything wrong. The way silence changed shape depending on who occupied it. I became hyper-aware of my own noise, my footsteps, the scrape of a chair against the floor, the sound of my sink running too long. I caught myself holding my breath while walking past the shared wall as if that might erase me from his awareness. It didn't help. He never addressed me directly, not by name, not with accusation, but the tone changed again, subtly this time. His words turned inward, reflective, like someone rehearsing answers to questions that hadn't been asked yet. "I keep wondering what they think," he said one night, "if they know or if they just listen." I recorded it with shaking hands. The idea that listening itself could be a form of judgment made my skin crawl. I hadn't said anything. I hadn't done anything. And yet here I was, collecting his words like artifacts, cataloging his guilt while carrying my own. I stopped inviting friends over entirely, not because I was afraid they'd hear him, but because I didn't trust myself to explain why I was so tense, why I flinched when someone raised their voice, even in laughter, why I kept glancing at the wall like it might interrupt. Work suffered, I missed deadlines. I reread the same emails without absorbing their meaning. My supervisor asked if everything was okay. I told her I hadn't been sleeping well. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. The truth had started to feel dangerous. One afternoon, I tried an experiment. I played one of the recordings out loud, standing close to the wall, volume low but audible. My own apartment filled with his voice, layered and disembodied, echoing back toward the place it came from. Nothing happened. No response, no pause, no sudden noise from the other side. I don't know what I'd expected. Recognition, maybe. Some sign that sound could travel both ways with intention, not just accident. I turned it off and sat down, my hands cold. That night he spoke less, shorter sentences, longer pauses. "I think about the sound a lot," he said eventually. "What carries, what doesn't." I felt sick. After that, I stopped the experiment. Days blurred together, nights stretched thin. The wall became a presence rather than a boundary. I found myself imagining what his apartment looked like. The layout, the furniture, whether he sat or stood when he spoke, whether the lights were on. I pictured him facing the wall deliberately, mouth close to the paint, voice measured. Then I pictured him turned away, words spilling out unintentionally, not meant for me at all. Both versions felt wrong. One night I heard him cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a single sharp inhale that broke his rhythm, followed by silence so complete it rang. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but something underneath it had shifted. "I don't think it matters anymore," he said. That scared me more than anything else he'd said before. I sat there, phone recording, heart racing, waiting for him to explain. He didn't. The next day, I searched his name. I shouldn't have been able to find it. I didn't even know it for sure. But I'd seen his mail once, stacked neatly on the floor outside his door. I'd noticed without meaning to, a last name distinctive enough to try. There was nothing obvious, no criminal record, no articles, no public accusations, just a thin digital footprint, a social media profile abandoned years ago, a few tagged photos from events that looked painfully normal. I stared at his face on my screen longer than I should have. He looked like anyone. That night, his voice returned to the past. "She kept asking if someone would notice," he said. "I told her yes." My throat tightened. I don't know why I said that. The way he said it, without defensiveness, without self-pity, made it worse. He wasn't just confessing, he was analyzing, revisiting, polishing the memory until it shone. I wondered if he was doing the same thing I was, replaying moments, adjusting details, trying to figure out where the story bent and where it broke. The wall felt thinner than ever. I started sitting on the floor at night, back against my bed, ear turned toward the wall like a ritual. I stopped pretending I wasn't listening. The lie had worn itself out. Listening became a burden I carried deliberately. One night, he said something that made my chest ache with recognition. I thought silence meant permission. I closed my eyes. That sentence didn't belong to him alone. It belonged to me too. I thought about the road again, the headlights, the argument, the way I'd convinced myself that not knowing was safer than knowing, that staying out of it was the responsible choice. I'd mistaken distance for innocence. Now distance felt impossible. His confessions began to loop. He repeated phrases almost word for word, as if testing how they sounded, as if waiting for them to change. "I didn't mean for it to happen. She trusted me. I should have stopped." Each repetition felt heavier than the last. I wondered how long this had been going on before I noticed. How many nights he'd spoken into the wall without an audience. Or worse, how many nights he'd known someone was there all along. The idea that I might not be the first listener unsettled me deeply. One evening, while sorting through the recordings, I noticed something strange. A gap. There was a night missing. A file that should have existed but didn't. I checked my backups, the cloud, the hard drive. Nothing. I was certain I'd recorded that night. I remembered doing it. Remembered the way his voice had sounded different, tighter, more controlled. The absence felt intentional. That night, he didn't speak at all. I sat awake until dawn, staring at the wall, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. When morning finally came, I felt hollowed out, like something essential had been removed. By then, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't just about him. It was about the space between us. The wall. The silence. The choice to hear and do nothing. And I was running out of places to hide from that choice. By the time the silence broke again, I was no longer surprised by how much I needed it to. That realization came with a sharp, unpleasant clarity. I had begun measuring my days by whether he spoke the night before, whether there was a new recording to catalog, a new fragment to dissect. The voice had woven itself into the structure of my life, becoming a constant reference point. Without it, I felt unmoored. When he finally spoke again, it was nearly 3 in the morning. "I was careful," he said. The sentence arrived without preamble, as if he'd been talking all along and I'd just tuned back in. My phone was already in my hand. I hadn't even remembered picking it up. I thought being careful was the same as being good. That distinction landed with a dull, heavy thud. I leaned my head back against the wall, feeling the faint vibration of his voice through the drywall. It was subtle, almost imagined, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop. I wondered how often people mistook restraint for morality. The next night, he described the aftermath. Not the act itself, he never did that, but what came after, the waiting, the listening, the constant recalibration of his own normal. "I kept checking the news," he said. "Waiting for my name to appear, it never did." There was no triumph in his voice, no relief, just a quiet statement of fact. I don't think that means anything anymore. That sentence echoed in my head long after the recording ended. I began to see his confessions as a map, not of what he'd done, but of what he feared. Exposure, recognition, being seen clearly. Each word felt like a test, dropped through the wall to see if it would be caught. I didn't know what it would mean to fail that test. One night, he said something that made me sit bolt upright. "I know someone else was there." My heart slammed into my ribs. "Not in the room," he clarified, "near enough." I felt cold all over. "There's always someone," he continued. "There usually is." The words threaded themselves through my memories, finding every place I'd left something unfinished, every moment I'd chosen not to notice. I realized then that he wasn't just confessing. He was building a narrative where responsibility was shared, diffused, spread thin enough to become bearable. And by listening, I was letting him. That thought made me nauseous. I considered confronting him. The idea came suddenly, fully formed, and terrified me with its clarity. Knock on his door. Say something, anything, that would collapse the distance between us. But what would I say? "I hear you. I know what you did. I was there too." Every version ended in the same place, exposure. So I stayed where I was. The recordings grew longer again. He began speaking in sequences, returning to the same nights in different orders, testing variations like drafts of an unfinished letter. "I thought someone would stop," he said. "I thought I would stop." I wondered which version hurt more. My dreams changed. The wall was no longer soft. It was transparent. I could see him clearly, sitting on the other side, speaking calmly while I pounded on the surface between us, my hands leaving no marks. I woke up with my fists clenched, nails digging into my palms. One morning, I noticed something else. A faint mark on the wall. It hadn't been there before, or maybe it had, and I'd only just allowed myself to see it. A small scuff about chest height, as if something had brushed against it from the other side. I touched it lightly, half expecting it to be warm. It wasn't. That night, his voice sounded closer again. "I don't talk because I want forgiveness," he said. "I talk because I want proof." Proof of what, I wondered. Proof that someone was listening. Proof that the story existed outside his head. Proof that the weight could be transferred. I felt my role in that exchange settle heavily on my shoulders. I started skipping recordings, letting nights pass without pressing the button, telling myself this was progress, that I was withdrawing from something unhealthy. But I still listened. The difference felt meaningless. One night, after a long pause, he said quietly, "It's strange what people notice." I leaned forward, heart racing. "They remember small things," he continued. "Details you forget to erase." The bracelet came back then like a ghost. "I thought it was gone," he said. "I was wrong." I squeezed my eyes shut, my breath shallow and fast. He didn't elaborate. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. My thoughts looped obsessively around that last sentence. I kept imagining the bracelet, where it might be, how it could still exist in the world, heavy with implication. That evening, as I walked down the hallway toward my apartment, I noticed his door was open again. Wider this time. I slowed, my pulse thudding in my ears. The apartment beyond was dark, the lights off. No sound came from inside. I stood there longer than I should have, the hallway stretching out behind me, empty and indifferent. Then I heard it. A soft noise from within, not a voice, not footsteps. Breathing. I stepped back instinctively, my heel catching on the carpet. The sound stopped. The door remained open. I didn't look inside. I couldn't. I retreated into my apartment, locking the door, pressing my back against it as if that could hold something out. That night, he didn't speak at all. The silence felt intentional, punitive. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in my body tuned to the wall. My phone lay on the bed beside me, recording app open, red dot waiting. Nothing came. Sometime just before dawn, I realized I was afraid not of what he might say next, but of what would happen if he stopped speaking altogether. Because then I would be alone with the knowledge, and there would be no wall left to blame. The next few days passed without his voice. That this was what I'd wanted all along. Silence, distance, an end to the constant intrusion, but relief never arrived. Instead, the absence pressed in from all sides, heavier than sound ever had. I started leaving the television on at night, not to mask anything, but to reassure myself that noise still existed, that the world hadn't narrowed itself down to a single wall and the thoughts it carried. Even with the TV on, I listened. I listened for the faintest vibration, the smallest shift in air that might signal his return. Every creak of the building made my heart jump. Every distant voice in the hallway sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was no longer waiting for him. I was bracing. On the fourth night of silence, I did something I hadn't done since all of this began. I knocked on the wall. It was a stupid, impulsive act. I hadn't planned it. The thought barely registered before my knuckles tapped twice against the drywall. The sound was soft, almost apologetic. I froze instantly, my hand still raised. Nothing happened. No response, no movement, no voice. The silence stretched, thick and unbroken. I lowered my hands slowly, my skin buzzing with embarrassment and fear. What had I expected? A reply? A confrontation? Some acknowledgement that the boundary between us had thinned beyond repair? I backed away from the wall and sat down on my bed, my heart racing. I didn't knock again. That night, sleep finally came, but it was shallow and fractured. I dreamed of corridors that led nowhere, of doors that opened onto blank walls. I woke repeatedly, disoriented, convinced I'd heard him start to speak. By morning, I felt worse than before. The following evening, as I prepared for bed, his voice returned. It was softer than I remembered. "I wondered if anyone would try," he said. My breath caught. "I thought about it a lot," he continued, "what it would sound like." I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, my legs weak beneath me. My phone slipped from my hand, hitting the mattress soundlessly. "I decided not to listen for it," he said. "Listening makes things complicated." I stared at the wall, my vision tunneling. "I think we all know that." The implication was unmistakable. I recorded the rest of that night with my hands clenched in my lap, nails biting into skin. He didn't say much else, just fragments, observations, thoughts that felt less like confessions and more like conclusions. "I don't think this is about guilt anymore. I think it's about witnesses." Witnesses. The word lingered, sharp and cold. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what that meant. A witness doesn't have to act. They don't even have to speak. Their role is defined by presence alone, by proximity, by attention. By listening. I wondered if the law would see it that way. If morality did, if I did. I started replaying the recordings not just for content, but for cues. Subtext, direction. Was he speaking to himself? To me? To some imagined authority he'd never face? Or was he rehearsing for the moment he'd finally be heard? One night he said something that shifted everything. "I don't remember her voice anymore." The way he said it, flat, almost puzzled, made my stomach churn. "I remember mine," he added. "I remember what I said." I closed my eyes, a wave of anger rising unexpectedly, violently. Anger at him, at myself, at the ease with which voices like his survived while others disappeared entirely. "That seems unfair," he said quietly, as if responding to my thoughts. I felt dizzy. The line between coincidence and intent blurred until it no longer mattered. After that, I began to fear the wall itself, not because of what passed through it, but because of what it held back. How easily it allowed one version of reality to exist beside another without conflict. I pressed my ear against it one afternoon, the building quiet in daylight, and felt nothing. No vibration, no warmth, just emptiness. That emptiness felt deliberate. I started to imagine what would happen if I moved out. The thought came unbidden, seductive in its simplicity. New walls, new neighbors, no voice. But the recordings would come with me. The memory would come with me. And the knowledge that I had stayed, listened, for as long as I did would not dissolve with distance. I realized then that this wasn't something I could outrun. One night, after a long pause, he said, "I don't know how this ends." For the first time, his voice wavered slightly. "I used to think endings were decisions," he continued. "Now I think they're just the point where people stop paying attention." The sentence landed like a verdict. I sat there long after he stopped speaking, the room silent except for my own breathing. The wall loomed beside me, solid and indifferent, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Separating, containing, allowing. I understood then that the wall had never been the problem. It had simply made room for the truth to exist without resistance. And I had accepted that arrangement. The last night of part one didn't arrive with drama. No revelation. No confrontation. No sudden clarity. Just another night where I lay awake, listening. He spoke only once. "I keep wondering," he said, voice low and measured, "when something becomes shared." I stared at the wall, my eyes tracing the familiar imperfections in the paint. The scuff near the corner. The faint hairline crack that ran upward and disappeared into the ceiling. "When it stops being mine," he continued, "and starts being ours." The word landed hard. Ours. I didn't record that night. Not because I forgot. Not because I was asleep. Because for the first time, I understood what the recordings actually were. They weren't evidence. They weren't protection. They weren't even documentation. They were participation. I'd told myself that listening was passive, that silence was neutral, that not acting was the same as not choosing. But silence, I realized, is never empty. It holds things. It shelters them. It allows them to continue without resistance. On the other side of the wall, he stopped speaking. The quiet that followed wasn't relief. It wasn't peace. It was weight. I lay there until morning, my body rigid, my thoughts looping endlessly around the same truth I could no longer avoid. I had been nearby once before. On a road. In the dark. I had heard something then too. And I had done exactly what I was doing now. Nothing. As the first light of dawn crept into the room, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost cruel. This wasn't the story of a man confessing. It was the story of a witness, deciding how long they could live with what they knew. I didn't know yet what I would do. But I knew this. The wall had done its job perfectly. It had kept us separate just enough. For both of us to believe we were alone. I told myself coincidence was possible. Cities are dense with overlap, lives brushing past each other without ever touching. You can hear a stranger's laughter through a window, smell their cooking through a vent, know the rhythm of their footsteps without ever knowing their name. It happens all the time. That's what I told myself. But coincidence is fragile. It doesn't hold up well under repetition. The more I listened, the harder that lie became to keep intact. He started mentioning places I knew, not all at once, not obviously. A corner store with flickering lights, a stretch of road where the shoulder dips suddenly, a parking lot that always smells faintly of oil and wet concrete. He never named them directly. He didn't have to. Recognition did the work for him. One night he said my street name. Just once. Casually. As if it meant nothing. That was when my body reacted before my mind did. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. My hands went numb. A wave of heat rushed up my neck and settled behind my eyes. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I might faint, and then being angry at myself for thinking that when the situation clearly demanded something else. He didn't repeat it. He didn't emphasize it. He moved on immediately, continuing his steady narration like he hadn't just rearranged the structure of my fear. But the damage was done. I didn't sleep at all that night. I paced my apartment until dawn, replaying recordings, isolating syllables, listening for intent the way people listen for hidden messages in static. I wasn't looking for proof anymore. I was looking for direction. Was he speaking into the wall by accident? Or by design? I began to wonder how long he'd known. Whether the shift in his confessions had been spontaneous or responsive. Whether the pauses had been moments of thought or moments of listening. The idea that he might have been shaping his words around my presence made my skin crawl. I started paying attention to myself in ways I never had before. How often I came and went. What time I turned my lights off. The sound my door made when it closed. I tried to imagine how much of me leaked through the wall without my permission. It felt like being slowly outlined by someone else's awareness. I saw him once in the parking lot. It was late afternoon, the sky heavy with cloud cover, the kind of light that makes everything look flatter than it should. I was unlocking my car when I noticed someone standing a few spaces away, digging through the trunk of an older sedan. Ordinaries. Unremarkables. He closed the trunk and turned just as I looked up. We made eye contact. He was taller than I'd imagined. That surprised me for some reason. His face was calm, neutral, arranged into something polite without effort. He nodded at me the way neighbors do, brief, automatic, devoid of curiosity. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. That was it. No recognition. No tension. No sign that the voice I knew so well belonged to the person standing in front of me. Or maybe that was the sign. As I drove away, my hands shook on the steering wheel. My mind kept replaying the sound of his voice layered over the image of his face, trying to reconcile the two. They didn't quite line up. The man in the parking lot seemed smaller somehow, less contained, less deliberate. That night, his confessions shifted again. Less about what he did, more about what it meant to be heard. "I don't want to carry this alone," he said. The sentence lodged itself in my chest and refused to move. Because 6 years ago, I'd heard something too. An argument, raised voices, a moment that lingered just long enough to be inconvenient. I'd told myself it wasn't my business, that someone else would intervene, that getting involved would only make things worse. I'd driven on. That memory had dulled with time, smoothed over by distance and rationalization. But now it surfaced sharp and vivid, stripped of its excuses. The recordings began to feel different after that. Not heavier, but closer. I started noticing subtle changes in his delivery, how certain words were weighted, how some sentences seemed placed rather than spoken. I couldn't shake the sense that the wall was no longer a barrier, it was a channel. Then one morning, his apartment was empty. No furniture, no boxes, no signs of a rush. Just gone. I stood in the hallway longer than I should have, staring at the open doorway. The space beyond looked stripped, almost staged, clean in a way that felt intentional rather than hurried. A neighbor passed behind me, nodded politely, kept walking. No one else seemed to notice. I went back inside my apartment, my chest tight, my thoughts racing. I told myself this was good. That distance meant safety, that whatever this had been, it was over now. That night, I checked my phone out of habit. There was a new audio file. I don't remember recording it. It was short, less than a minute. At first, I thought the sound was interference, static movement, something brushing against the microphone. Then I recognized it. My breathing. Slow, uneven, close. The recording continued for several seconds before his voice appeared. Clear. Calm. Certain. You stayed. I sat there in the dark, phone shaking in my hand, the weight of that sentence pressing down on me from all sides. That was when I knew. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't proximity. This wasn't accident. This was recognition. And whatever came next, it had already begun. I didn't listen to the file again right away. Not because I was afraid of what it contained. I already knew that. But because I needed a few seconds to pretend I still had control over when this happened. Over how much of it I let in. I placed the phone face down on the bed, as if denying it eye contact might dull its certainty. You stayed. The words echoed anyway. I stood up and paced the length of my apartment, every step measured, every sound suddenly too loud. My own breathing felt intrusive now, like I was the one bleeding through walls. I checked the locks. Once, twice. I pressed my ear to my front door, listening to the hallway, half expecting footsteps that never came. When I finally picked the phone back up, my hands were steady in a way that scared me. I replayed the file. This time I noticed details I'd missed before. The angle of the sound, the proximity. It wasn't recorded from my usual position near the wall. It was closer. Too close. The microphone had picked up the faint scrape of fabric, the small, unconscious noises people make when they think they're alone. When his voice came in, there was no echo, no muffling. You stayed, he said again. Not accusing. Not grateful. Observational. I scrolled through my recording history, my pulse thudding in my ears. The timestamp didn't match any night I remembered recording. There was no accidental activation I could explain away. No corrupted file name. Just a clean entry placed neatly among the others like it belonged. The idea that my phone had been used without my knowledge felt less frightening than the alternative. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with the lights on, phone in my lap, staring at the wall like it might move. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It felt deliberate, curated, like someone had decided it was time to let the absence do the work instead. I kept thinking about his apartment, how empty it had been, how intentionally cleared, not abandoned, not fled. Closed. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I didn't try to justify it. I didn't have the energy to perform normalcy for anyone else. I spent the day replaying memories instead, laying them out like evidence on a table I'd avoided sitting at for years. The road, the argument, the way I'd looked straight ahead and told myself I couldn't be sure. I'd been close enough to hear, close enough to help, close enough to stay. That word had always felt passive to me before, neutral, unremarkable. Now it felt like an accusation. By afternoon, I realized something else. The recordings weren't just confessions. They were a timeline, not of the crime, but of me, of how long I'd been listening, how long I'd been present, how gradually my silence had been shaped into something useful. I thought about the first night, how accidental it had felt, how easy it was to excuse myself then. I wondered if he'd been listening for me too. That evening, I went for a walk. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to move to put distance between myself and the wall, even if I knew distance no longer meant what it used to. The streets were familiar, almost comforting. I passed places he'd mentioned, landmarks that now felt subtly altered by association. Everywhere I went, I felt watched, not in the paranoid sense, but in the way you feel when you know someone else could place you on a map. I returned home after dark. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. His door was closed now, the frame clean, no trace of the openness I'd seen before. I hesitated outside my own apartment, keys heavy in my hand. For a moment, I considered knocking on his door. Not to confront him, not to accuse, just to confirm that he was real, that the voice had a body. That recognition went both ways. I didn't knock. Inside, my apartment felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone who'd been away too long. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened the recording app without pressing anything, staring at the waveform waiting for a sound that didn't come. Hours passed. Then just before midnight, my phone buzzed. Another file. This one longer. I didn't play it immediately. I watched the progress bar fill as if I could divine intent from duration alone. When I finally pressed play, his voice emerged smoothly without hesitation. "You thought about leaving," he said. My breath caught. "That makes sense," he continued. "Most people do." I felt my spine press into the headboard, as if my body was trying to create distance my mind no longer believed in. "I didn't," he said. "I stayed right where I was." There was a pause, longer than usual. I needed to see who else would. I stopped the recording before it finished. My chest hurt, not sharp pain, pressure, accumulated weight, the kind that builds slowly until you don't remember what it felt like before it was there. This was no longer about confession. It was about alignment. He wasn't trying to absolve himself. He was trying to establish parity, to redraw the boundaries of responsibility until they enclosed both of us. I understood then what recognition meant. It wasn't that he knew I was listening. It was that he had decided what that meant. And he was inviting me to accept it. I didn't know yet whether I would. But I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The story was no longer happening on the other side of the wall. It was happening to me. I started keeping my phone off at night. Not airplane mode, off, completely. I told myself it was a boundary, a line I could still draw. If nothing else, it would prove that whatever was happening required my participation to continue. It didn't help. Even without the phone, I listened. I listened to the wall, to the building, to the quiet spaces where a voice used to be. Silence had learned how to speak by then. It pressed against me in the same shape his words once had. I slept in fragments, short, shallow stretches that ended with me jolting awake, convinced I'd missed something important. Each time I checked the phone first, each time nothing. By the third night, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. Turning the phone off wasn't resistance. It was avoidance. And avoidance had been my specialty for a long time. During the day, I tried to reconstruct his timeline more deliberately. I spread notes across my kitchen table, dates, phrases, places. The recordings played softly in the background, low enough that they blended into the room like ambient noise. I hated myself for how normal that felt. The more I listened, the clearer it became that his confessions weren't random. They were curated. He never contradicted himself. He corrected himself. He returned to moments with new language, refined them, adjusted emphasis. He was practicing a version of the truth he could live with. And he wanted to know if I could live with it too. I began to notice how often he used conditional language. I thought, I assumed, I didn't realize until later. Every sentence built space around his actions, room for interpretation, room for someone else to step in and share the weight. That's when I understood the real danger. He wasn't trying to be forgiven. He was trying to be understood. And understanding, I knew, can be a kind of consent. I went back to the parking lot where I'd seen him. I don't know why, curiosity maybe, or the hope that repetition would strip the moment of its power. It looked exactly the same as before. Oil stains on concrete, a bent shopping cart abandoned near the fence, the hum of distant traffic. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning faces as people came and went. He didn't appear. Instead, I noticed how easy it was to imagine him anywhere. At the corner store, at the bus stop. Walking past me on the sidewalk with his head down, voice silent but present all the same. Recognition had expanded him. That night, I turned the phone back on. There was a new file waiting. I didn't flinch this time. I sat on the bed, back against the wall, and pressed play. "You're probably wondering why I'm still talking," he said. I closed my eyes. "I wondered too," he continued. "At first it was habit, then it was necessity." A pause. "Now I think it's structure." Structure. The word resonated uncomfortably, as if the act of speaking had become the framework holding everything else in place. "When something terrible happens," he said, "people want it to end, but endings are messy. They don't resolve anything, they just stop the noise." I thought of the missing woman, the way the news coverage had tapered off, how silence had eventually replaced urgency. "I don't want it to just stop," he said. "I want it to mean something." The implication was clear. Meaning required an audience. I stopped the recording midway through, my head spinning. That was the night I decided I couldn't stay neutral anymore. Not because neutrality was impossible, but because it was exactly what he needed. The next morning, I gathered everything. The recordings, the notes, the memory I'd spent years burying. I didn't know yet where I would take them. I only knew I couldn't keep holding them alone. The weight had shifted. It no longer belonged entirely to him. And that terrified me. As I packed the files onto a drive, I noticed something new, a pattern I'd missed before. Several recordings had been made at times I knew I wasn't home. Late afternoons, early evenings, moments when my phone should have been in my pocket, not recording audio from my apartment. The realization chilled me. Either the files were being placed deliberately, or the boundary between listening and being listened to had collapsed entirely. That night, as if in response to the thought, his voice returned, not through the wall, not through the phone. Through memory. I heard him say clearly, calmly, "You don't have to decide yet." I sat in the dark, heart pounding, understanding at last what recognition truly meant. It wasn't mutual awareness. It was shared responsibility. And once that line is crossed, there is no such thing as simply listening anymore. I didn't go to the police right away. That delay matters, not legally, morally. Because by then, this wasn't fear stopping me. It wasn't uncertainty. It was something quieter and harder to admit. I was still deciding what version of myself I could live with. Every confession he'd made had forced me to examine my own silence, my own proximity, my own convenient interpretations of responsibility. If I spoke now, I wouldn't just be exposing him. I'd be indicting myself. That night I played the very first recording again, the one ID made without thinking, the one where his voice sounded closest, most unguarded. I didn't mean for it to happen. I listened carefully, not for guilt, not for cruelty, but for hesitation. There was none. That was when I understood the final truth of part 2. Recognition hadn't changed him. It had stabilized him. He had found a way to distribute the weight of what he'd done without ever relinquishing control of the story. And I had allowed it, not by speaking, but by staying. I looked at the wall one last time that night, not with fear, not with anger, but with something like resignation. Whatever came next would require movement. And movement would mean choosing. I went to the police with everything. Not dramatically. Not courageously. I sat in a small, beige room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, my hands folded tightly in my lap, and told the story out of order because that's how it lived in me. The recordings first, then the wall, then the road 6 years ago. I watched their faces carefully, not for shock but for disbelief. I didn't get it. They listened the way professionals do, quietly, neutrally, without promising anything their voices couldn't guarantee. One officer asked me why I'd waited. I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer didn't sound good out loud. Months passed. No updates. No reassurance. No closure. I moved out of the apartment before the lease ended. New walls, thicker ones, different sounds. No familiar rhythms to map my nights around. But silence didn't feel safe anymore. It felt loaded. I began noticing how often people mistake quiet for peace, how we assume the absence of noise means the absence of harm. I knew better now. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. Listening is attention. Attention is validation. And validation, intentional or not, shapes behavior. That doesn't mean silence is violence in every case. That's too easy, too clean, but silence is never neutral, and I will never believe that again. Some nights when I can't sleep, I think about walls, about what they're designed to do. They don't protect. They don't accuse. They don't absolve. They simply allow proximity without responsibility. I don't live like that anymore. When I hear something that feels wrong now, an argument escalating, a voice breaking, a moment that asks to be ignored, I don't wait for certainty. Certainty is what we invent to avoid acting. I act imperfectly, awkwardly, sometimes unnecessarily. But I act. That's the only difference between who I was and who I am now. I didn't commit a crime, but I didn't interrupt one either. And that truth doesn't fade with time. It sharpens. The wall is quiet now. But I listen differently. Not for confessions. Not for permission. For the moment where staying silent would be the loudest choice of all.